The last bell echoed through the school courtyard like the end of a long symphony. Students spilled out of the red brick building, some laughing, others glued to their phones, while parents waited in parked cars lined up along the faded white stripes of the school parking lot. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows across the pavement, and the faint buzz of cicadas merged with the rustling of backpacks and sneakers. Among the crowd stood a man whose presence didn't scream for attention, but somehow commanded it anyway. Jason Statham leaned against the hood of a dark grey SUV, arms crossed, sunglasses shielding his eyes. He wasn't a celebrity here. He was just a father waiting for his daughter, and he preferred it that way. The former soldier, stunt driver, and disciplined martial artist now lived for quieter days. Days like this. But even the calmest waters could hide sharp rocks underneath. His daughter, Sophie, emerged through the school doors moments later, 14 years old, thoughtful, quiet, still discovering herself in a world far louder than she was. She wore her backpack loosely slung over one shoulder and a hint of a smile as she spotted her father waiting. Jason raised a hand in a simple wave. She smiled wider and began walking toward him, but paused midway, glancing nervously to her side. A boy, perhaps a year or two older, stood in her path. Blonde, athletic, smug in a way that only boys with overconfident fathers could be. He leaned closer than he should have, whispered something in Sophie's ear that made her take a step back. His friends laughed from a distance, phones out, capturing the moment like it was entertainment. Jason's jaw clenched behind his sunglasses. He didn't move yet. He observed, measured. Sophie looked uncomfortable, trapped. The boy blocked her way, stepping with arrogant precision. Another comment. Another laugh. She tried to sidestep him, but he mirrored her movements like a game. Jason stood straight, exhaled, and began walking. Each step across the parking lot was steady, deliberate, not rushed, not aggressive. But there was a weight to his movement, a rhythm that made a few teachers glance his way through classroom windows. Something about him disrupted the ordinary, like a storm forming where none had been forecast. The boy didn't notice him approaching until Jason was only a few feet away. Sophie's eyes lit up with relief. The boy's smirk faltered. Jason stopped beside his daughter and looked down at the boy, not with anger, but with a quiet force that spoke louder than words ever could. His stance alone made the boy step back, if only half an inch. Enough. Jason placed a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her toward the car without a single word. No threats, no insults, just presence. The kind that lingers. But in a world addicted to ego, silence is often mistaken for weakness. As Jason opened the passenger door for his daughter, a new voice rang out across the lot. Louder, coarser, and coming in fast. "You got a problem with my kid?" The voice was thunder, booming, arrogant, challenging. A man stormed across the pavement in an oil-stained t-shirt and combat boots, a cigarette still dangling from his lip. Broad-shouldered, red-faced, and already halfway to fury, parents looked up. Teachers hesitated at the doors. Even the boy, who seconds ago felt untouchable, suddenly looked small. Jason turned slowly, closing the passenger door behind Sophie with calm precision. She sat inside, eyes wide, lips trembling. The man stomped to a stop in front of Jason, chest puffed, veins flaring in his neck. "You think you can come near my son? Lay a finger on him. Who the hell do you think you are?" Jason didn't answer. Not yet. His hands stayed loose at his sides. His eyes didn't blink. But something shifted in the air, the way it does before a storm breaks, a hush even among the chaos. He looked once, briefly, toward the crowd forming at a distance, teachers frozen on the sidewalk, other kids watching through windshields. Then his gaze returned to the man. He wasn't dealing with a father defending his child. He was facing a man who raised his son to disrespect women and expected applause for it. Jason's silence only enraged him more. The man stepped closer, invading the invisible boundary most men instinctively respected. "You want to play hero? Think that stare's gonna scare me?" He jabbed a finger toward Jason's chest. Jason didn't move, not yet. But Sophie was watching from the car now, her face pressed to the window, fear painted across her expression. Jason saw it, and that was enough. He lowered his voice, not to speak, but to steady himself. Then he took one subtle, silent step forward. The space between them disappeared. The man opened his mouth to say something else, to puff himself up even further, but he never got the chance. In one impossibly fast motion, Jason deflected the pointing finger, stepped in, and executed a clean, controlled takedown. A maneuver born from years of training, meant not to injure but to end a fight before it could start. The man hit the ground hard, breath stolen from his lungs, dust kicking up from the pavement. Jason didn't punch him, didn't shout. He simply stood over the man, eyes locked, heart steady, pulse calm. And then, from inside the SUV, Sophie's voice pierced the air. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, but Jason heard her. She was afraid, not of him, but of what this could become. His hands tightened once, then loosened. Jason stepped back. Let the man breathe. Let the weight of the silence settle in. And just as a few parents began to whisper, just as the crowd held their collective breath, Jason leaned down. What he said wasn't spoken aloud, but what he meant. It would echo in the man's mind for the rest of his life. As Jason walked back toward the car, leaving a broken ego on the asphalt, something strange happened. The man on the ground didn't get up. Not right away, not like someone hurt, but like someone shaken, like someone realizing too late that real strength doesn't scream. It whispers with clarity. The man lay still for a moment longer, as if the weight of the moment had knocked more than just the air out of him. His pride, once bloated and loud, now lay deflated against the pavement. Around him, the quiet of the parking lot grew louder, not from noise, but from the absence of it. No one laughed, no one filmed. Even the students, usually eager to see chaos unfold, remained frozen behind tinted windshields and half-open car doors. Jason Statham stood a few feet away now, his back turned, walking calmly toward his car. Not because he was indifferent, but because he had seen this kind of man too many times before. The ones who mistook arrogance for courage, who raised their sons to echo the same hollow bravado, and who only understood respect after tasting humility. Sophie watched from the passenger seat, her eyes wide, hands still clenched around the fabric of her jeans. She hadn't seen everything, but she had seen enough. Enough to feel safe, enough to feel proud, but also enough to feel afraid. Not of her father, but of how close things had come to spiraling out of control. Jason opened the driver's door slowly and paused before getting in. He took a deep breath, not to calm himself, but to come back to center. That moment, those few seconds after a confrontation, were always the most important. When adrenaline still pulsed like electricity under the skin, when one wrong breath could restart a fire. He glanced once more toward the man still sitting on the asphalt. A teacher had finally started to approach. A security guard lingered by the school's glass doors, unsure whether to intervene or observe. But Jason wasn't looking for permission. He never had. He got in the car, closed the door, and for a long second, said nothing. Inside the SUV, the silence was different, thick with meaning. Sophie turned her face toward the window, her reflection blurry against the glass. Jason looked at her, not to explain himself, but to read her reaction. Her hands were steadier now, her breathing slower. But her eyes, they carried questions. Not about violence, but about control, about why some men lose it, and why others never need to. As he started the car, the engine hummed softly beneath them. They pulled away from the lot, leaving behind a scene that would be talked about in every household that night. But none of those stories would truly capture what happened, because what unfolded wasn't about a fight. It was about what stopped it. Across the lot, the man finally got to his feet, helped halfway up by a teacher who barely knew what to say. He brushed dust from his jeans, trying to salvage the tatters of his pride. But the eyes around him saw it clearly now. He wasn't a protector, he was a warning. Back in the car, Jason took a turn down a quiet neighborhood road. Trees lined the sidewalks, their branches catching the evening light like stained glass. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sophie finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a look. She had questions, unspoken ones, about when to stand your ground, about why some men choose peace until peace is no longer an option, about how to remain strong without becoming cold. Jason reached over and turned down the air conditioning. A small gesture, almost meaningless, but it broke the tension. Sometimes daughters don't need lectures, they need presence. And Jason gave her that. Back in the parking lot, word had spread fast. Phones buzzed, parents whispered, teachers exchanged glances as they crossed the lot with car keys and concerned glances. The boy, the one who had disrespected Sophie, stood silent beside a pickup truck, his face pale, his phone shoved deep in his pocket. His friends didn't laugh anymore, and the man, his father, avoided everyone's eyes. He didn't limp, he didn't whimper, but he carried something heavier than pain, the weight of being seen for who he truly was. Meanwhile, Jason and Sophie arrived at a quiet diner just outside town, not because they were hungry, but because they needed to breathe, to reset. Inside, the lights were soft, the booths half-filled, the scent of coffee and grilled cheese floating through the air like nostalgia. Jason chose a booth in the corner, where no one recognized him, where he could just be a father, not a headline. Sophie sat across from him, stirring her soda with a straw, and finally, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. It said, "I'm okay." And Jason, for the first time that afternoon, allowed himself to exhale fully, because he had chosen the line. The moment where restraint had overcome rage, where control had held back destruction, where a daughter had spoken and a father had listened. That's what people would never understand. It wasn't the takedown that mattered. It was the decision to let go, to not strike again, to let the lesson live longer than the bruise. The waitress brought their food with a kind smile. Jason thanked her with a nod, and Sophie finally spoke, softly, just enough for him to hear, and though her voice trembled slightly, it held pride. That day in the parking lot wouldn't define her, but it would stay with her, because she had seen something most kids never do. A father who was strong enough to fight and wise enough not to finish. But the story didn't end at the diner. Later that night, someone knocked on Jason's door. Not the police, not a neighbor, but the last person he expected, with words that would reopen a wound Jason thought he had buried long ago. The night settled over the neighborhood like a warm blanket stitched with silence. Streetlights hummed faintly, casting amber halos onto the pavement. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance, and the world, at least for a while, seemed to exhale. Jason stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last plate from dinner. Sophie was already upstairs, her bedroom door cracked just enough to let out a sliver of soft music. The house felt still, safe, the kind of quiet that fathers cherish after long days, especially days like this one. He reached for a towel, dried his hands slowly, and glanced at the clock. 9:41 p.m. Nothing about this moment felt unusual, until it did. 3 knocks on the door, firm, even, measured. Jason froze, not from fear, but from instinct. In his world, doors never knocked like that without reason. It wasn't a neighbor, wasn't a delivery. It was someone with intent. He moved calmly through the house, flicking off a light as he went. Approaching the door, he paused, just long enough to sense what awaited on the other side. Then he opened it. A man stood there, not the one from the school lot. This one was older, worn in the face, eyes tired but sharp. A black leather jacket creased at the elbows. A sliver of an old scar ran down his jawline like a line drawn by memory. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. Jason didn't either, because he knew that face from another time, another life. The man's name was Daniel Cross, once a military brother, now a ghost. Jason didn't invite him in, not right away. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, every movement precise. Daniel spoke first, low, tense. It wasn't small talk, it wasn't personal. It was a warning. The man Jason had taken down in the school parking lot. His name wasn't just some parent in town. He had ties, connections, dangerous ones, a brother with a history, friends in places that preferred silence over justice. And now, they knew Jason's name. Daniel didn't come to threaten. He came to caution. Jason listened, jaw tight, eyes fixed. He had walked away from that world, had buried it under years of discipline and distance. But the past doesn't stay buried. Not when it feels insulted. Not when ego is bruised in public. Jason thanked Daniel with a nod, not out of gratitude, but acknowledgement. The message was clear. They're coming. Daniel turned and disappeared into the night, his motorcycle engine slicing through the silence moments later. Jason closed the door gently, then locked it, not out of fear, but out of preparation. He climbed the stairs slowly, checking each lock, each shadow. Sophie was asleep, her face lit by the glow of her nightlamp. A book lay open across her chest. He watched her for a moment. Not because he doubted her safety, but because he needed to remember what he was protecting. Downstairs, the air felt different now, charged. Not with panic, but with anticipation. Jason didn't pace. He sat, alone, at the edge of the couch, hands steepled together, and waited. Because this wasn't the kind of storm you run from. This was the kind you face. At 2:17 a.m., a car engine stalled in front of the house. Lights off, no movement. Jason stood up slowly. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for something far more dangerous. Restraint. Because tonight, the lesson wouldn't be for a schoolyard bully or an arrogant father, but for the men who thought they could still touch what Jason Statham swore to protect. Most of the neighborhood slept beneath the hush of the early morning hours, unaware that something had shifted just outside their doorsteps. The world was still, except for one house, where stillness was not a comfort, but a warning. Jason stood in the darkened hallway, every light in the house off, except for a single lamp glowing dimly in the kitchen behind him. He watched through the blinds as the car idled in front of his home. Its lights were off, the engine barely audible, but to Jason it sounded like a war drum. He didn't move fast, he moved deliberately. He stepped into the garage, barefoot, calm, precise. No weapons, no theatrics, just awareness, just years of training carried quietly beneath the surface. Outside, two doors creaked open. A figure stepped onto the curb, another exited the passenger side. They weren't kids, they weren't local troublemakers. These men moved with purpose, shoulders squared, hands hidden, expressions unreadable in the dark. Jason opened the front door before they even made it halfway up the walkway. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask why they were there. His eyes did the talking, but they kept coming. One of them stepped ahead, speaking in low, confident tones, words that didn't matter. They came with a message, yes, but they expected fear. They expected retreat. They expected something Jason had never offered a man in his life, submission. And that was their first mistake. The man reached into his jacket, not fast, but fast enough. Jason's body responded before his mind even caught up. Not violence, precision. In one fluid motion, Jason stepped forward, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it upward, and sent him to the ground without a sound. The second man moved, wrongly, a wide stance, too much commitment. Jason's elbow struck clean across his temple, and the man collapsed like a felled tree. Silence again. Not a single neighbor stirred. No sirens, no alarms. Only two unconscious men on Jason's front lawn, and a daughter still asleep upstairs. Jason crouched beside the first man, checked his pockets. No weapon, just a phone, unlocked. A message on the screen still open. "We scare him, that's all." He stood slowly, because they had failed. They came to intimidate. Instead, they became a lesson. Jason dragged both men to the curb, propped them against the car like discarded warnings, and set the phone beside one of them. Then he did something that would speak louder than fists. He wrote a note, not with threats, not with rage, but with clarity. And he left it tucked into the driver's side mirror. Then he walked back into the house, not looking back once. Inside, he washed his hands. The cold water grounded him. He dried them with a towel, poured himself a glass of water, and checked on Sophie. She hadn't stirred, but she would ask about tonight someday. And when she did, he wouldn't tell her about the takedowns. He'd tell her about the restraint, about the discipline, about how true strength is the ability to end a threat without losing yourself in the process. As he sat in the living room once more, the night began to feel softer, not because danger was gone, but because he had faced it without becoming it. But the next day, as Jason drove Sophie back to school, a man in a suit waited by the gate. He wasn't from town, he wasn't from the district, he wasn't even from the state. And the envelope in his hand didn't contain a threat. It carried an offer, one that could change everything. The sun rose gently over the rooftops, spilling light across the suburban streets like forgiveness after a storm. The day felt new, clean, like nothing had happened the night before, but something had. Jason didn't speak of it. He packed Sophie's lunch, handed her a thermos, and checked the oil in the SUV before they left. She had a math test that morning. That's what she was worried about. That's what mattered to her now. And Jason, he wanted it to stay that way. The road to the school was quiet, only a few cars ahead of them in the drop-off line. Birds fluttered across street signs. A mother walked her child across the crosswalk, clutching a tiny backpack in one hand, coffee in the other. But as they pulled closer to the school gate, Jason saw him. A man in a dark suit, polished shoes planted with intention on the sidewalk. He wasn't lost. He wasn't there by accident. He waited. Jason parked, heart steady, but instincts on alert. He told Sophie to head in, wished her luck on the test, and waited until she disappeared through the school doors. Then he stepped out of the car. The suited man didn't move. Jason approached slowly. They didn't shake hands, they didn't smile. But there was no tension, just recognition between two men who had lived long lives in few words. The man held out an envelope. Jason didn't take it yet. He waited. The man spoke, not in threats, not in riddles, but plainly. He represented something bigger, not a government agency, not a security firm, something more private, more focused. He had watched the video from the school parking lot. Not from a child's phone, but from a camera Jason hadn't noticed on the side of a nearby building, motion-activated, high-resolution, forgotten by most. They saw what Jason did, and what he chose not to do. They saw the control, the power held back, the awareness to stop when others would keep going. And that was what they wanted. The envelope didn't hold money, it held a request, an invitation to help train those who hadn't learned control yet. Young men, veterans returning home, high-level operatives who had the skills, but not the restraint. Men who needed to understand what Jason lived by, that the greatest strength is knowing when not to strike. Jason didn't answer right away. He took the envelope, nodded once, and walked back to his car. Later that evening, he opened it, read every word. It wasn't about glory, it was about legacy. A chance to pass on something greater than combat. Something Sophie would understand one day. That night, they had dinner together again. No phone on the table, no news, just food and quiet laughter. Jason asked about the math test. Sophie smiled. Maybe she'd passed, maybe not. But her eyes said she was at peace. She didn't know what had happened at 2:17 a.m. She didn't need to, because Jason had made sure she would grow up believing that strength doesn't live in fists, it lives in fathers who stand between danger and innocence and walk away before darkness pulls them in. The world would keep moving. New threats would come, challenges would rise, but Jason, he was ready, because he had nothing to prove, only something to protect. In a world where too many men confuse noise for power, Jason Statham reminded everyone that true strength is silent. It shows up early, it leaves late, and it stands firm, not to be seen, but to make sure someone else never feels small again.